The Cold War did not feel like peace. That is the first thing that needs to be understood before anything else is said. The idea that the decades between 1947 and 1991 represented some stable, if anxious, interval between real wars is a comforting revision of history, and it is largely false. What actually existed during those years was a sustained and institutionalized proximity to annihilation. The weapons were real. The targeting coordinates were locked in. The submarines were submerged and on station. The bombers were airborne on rotating schedules, loaded and fueled, waiting for authentication codes that could arrive at any moment from ground stations that were themselves waiting for orders that could come from men who were themselves operating under standing protocols that did not always require their direct authorization. This was not metaphor. This was infrastructure. The Cold War produced a particular kind of tension that has no precise name in ordinary language. It was not the tension of a crisis because crises eventually resolve. It was not the tension of anticipation because anticipation implies a defined event to wait for. It was closer to a permanent background frequency, a hum in the machinery of two civilizations pointed at each other with enough destructive capacity to end organized human life on the surface of the planet, and the hum never stopped. It ran through every decade, through every administration, through every arms treaty and diplomatic summit and public statement about stability and deterrence. The systems kept running. The warheads stayed armed. The submarines kept their silence beneath the oceans and waited. What happened inside that silence, in the control rooms and the bunkers and the radar stations and the command posts, was a series of events that the public was not supposed to know about, and largely did not know about for decades. Some of those events are still not fully declassified. Some have been acknowledged only in fragments, through FOIA requests and archival research and the occasional memoir of someone who was present and decided, often near the end of their life, to say what they had seen. Taken together, those events form a different history of the Cold War than the one told in most textbooks. Not a history of policy and ideology and arms races measured in abstract megatonnage, but a history of specific moments when the distance between the world as it was and the world as it could have become was measured in minutes, sometimes in seconds, sometimes in the decision of a single person in a room with no windows who had a very short amount of time to make a choice that would determine whether hundreds of millions of people lived or died. There were 22 such moments that came close enough to the edge that they require attention, not because they are the only ones, and not because each one was necessarily more dangerous than others that did not make the final accounting, but because together they describe the actual texture of the Cold War with more accuracy than any diplomatic history can manage. They describe a conflict that was conducted not primarily through battles or invasions, but through procedures, through fail-safes that sometimes failed, through warning systems that sometimes warned of things that did not exist, through chains of command that sometimes broke at critical moments, and through human beings placed inside automated systems and asked to function as components rather than as people, and who sometimes succeeded at that task and sometimes did not. And the difference between those outcomes determined everything. The first of these moments begins not with a missile or a bomb, but with a piece of electronics. In October of 1960, the ballistic missile early warning system at Thule Air Base in Greenland reported an incoming Soviet missile attack. The alert was not minor. The system indicated an overwhelming strike was in progress, with confidence levels high enough to warrant immediate escalation up the command chain. Duty officers at NORAD began working through the response protocols. The alert was serious and the warning was insistent. What saved the situation, if saved is even the right word, was not a technical redundancy or a backup confirmation system. It was the fact that Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev was in New York at that moment, attending a United Nations session, and the idea that the Soviet Union would launch a nuclear first strike while its own leader was sitting in the target country seemed implausible enough to give pause to the people in the room. The actual cause of the alert was eventually determined to be the radar system's own signal bouncing off the surface of the moon. The moon had risen into the radar's field of view, and the system interpreted the return signal as an incoming attack. The moon, in October of 1960, triggered a nuclear alert that reached command levels of the United States military. This is the kind of event that, once known, changes the quality of everything else you know about the period. Because the Thule false alarm was not unique. It was representative of a systemic condition that ran through the entire Cold War, which is that the systems built to detect the beginning of nuclear war were operating in environments that generated false data, and the procedures built to respond to that data were calibrated for speed rather than deliberation, because the assumption embedded in every protocol was that the enemy was out there and that the enemy was capable of striking with very little warning, and that hesitation was more dangerous than error. The logic of deterrence created a system that was structurally predisposed toward false positives, and then placed human beings inside that system and told them that their most important job was to respond quickly. The second moment requires some context about geography and aircraft. In August of 1943, a B-17 bomber called the Lady Be Good departed from North Africa on a mission over Italy and never returned. The crew was eventually found years later in the Libyan desert, dead. That story has nothing directly to do with the Cold War except insofar as it established the basic operational reality that long-range aircraft sometimes went places they were not supposed to go and sometimes did not come back. By the early 1950s, the United States Air Force was conducting regular reconnaissance flights along the borders of the Soviet Union and increasingly over Soviet territory itself. These flights were not publicly acknowledged. They were conducted at high altitude in converted aircraft and later in purpose-built platforms like the U-2, and they produced intelligence about Soviet military capabilities that could not be obtained any other way. They also produced incidents. In 1954, a RB-47 reconnaissance aircraft on a mission along the Soviet coast was intercepted by Soviet fighters. The crew survived that particular encounter, but it established the pattern of what would follow. Over the next several years, American reconnaissance aircraft were shot down by Soviet forces on multiple occasions. In 1958, a C-130 transport was shot down over Armenia. All 17 crew members died. The United States government issued a statement claiming the aircraft had strayed off course accidentally while on a routine flight. The Soviet government claimed it had shot down a spy plane operating over its territory. Both statements contained portions of truth, and neither contained the complete picture. The families of the crew were not told the actual circumstances of the deaths for years. Then came May 1st, 1960, and Francis Gary Powers. The U-2 incident is well enough known in outline that it requires only specific emphasis here. Powers was flying a CIA reconnaissance mission over the Soviet Union when his aircraft was struck by a Soviet surface-to-air missile at altitude. He survived the shoot-down, was captured, was put on trial in Moscow, was convicted of espionage, and was eventually exchanged in 1962 for a Soviet intelligence officer held by the United States. The diplomatic fallout destroyed a planned summit between Eisenhower and Khrushchev and accelerated the deterioration in relations that would culminate 2 years later in the most dangerous confrontation of the entire Cold War. But the aspect of the U-2 incident that receives the least attention is the contingency planning that surrounded it. The authorization procedures for those flights included provisions for what would happen if a pilot was captured. The assumption, built into the mission briefings, was that a pilot shot down at U-2 altitude would not survive. The aircraft came equipped with a destruction mechanism. Powers was also given access to a suicide pin. He did not use it. The assumption embedded in the mission planning proved wrong, and the consequences of that error played out on the world stage for years. The third moment takes place in the water rather than the air. In October of 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, 4 Soviet submarines were operating in the Caribbean, carrying nuclear-armed torpedoes. This detail was not known to the American naval forces conducting anti-submarine operations around the quarantine line. The submarines were designated Foxtrot class, diesel-electric boats that required periodic surfacing to recharge their batteries, and the combination of tropical heat, American depth charge harassment, and communication difficulties with Moscow had pushed the crews to the edge of their physical and psychological limits. On board the submarine designated B-59, conditions had deteriorated to the point where carbon dioxide levels were dangerously high, and the crew had been without reliable contact with Moscow for days. On October 27, 1962, the day that is generally regarded as the most dangerous single day of the Cuban Missile Crisis, American destroyers located B-59 and began dropping practice depth charges to signal the submarine to surface. The captain of B-59, Valentin Savitsky, did not know these were practice charges. He concluded that war had begun. He ordered the nuclear torpedo to be armed and prepared for launch. Under Soviet naval procedures at that time, the authorization to fire the nuclear torpedo required agreement from the captain, the political officer, and a third senior officer. The captain and the political officer both agreed. The third officer, Vasily Arkhipov, who happened to be the flotilla commander and therefore of equivalent rank to the captain, refused. Arkhipov argued that they should surface and make contact with Moscow before taking irreversible action. After a confrontation that witnesses later described as extremely intense, Savitsky agreed. B-59 surfaced. The nuclear torpedo was not fired. Vasily Arkhipov is, in the most literal sense that the phrase can be applied, the person who may have saved the world on October 27, 1962. He was not a policy architect. He was not a president or a premier or a secretary of state. He was a naval officer on a submarine that had been depth charged to the edge of catastrophe. And he said no when the protocol allowed him to say no. And that refusal is the reason the Cuban Missile Crisis ended the way it did, rather than the way it almost ended. He died in 1998. For most of his life, his role in the events of that day was not publicly known. The Cuban Missile Crisis produced other near misses that operated in parallel. On the same day, October 27th, an American U-2 reconnaissance aircraft was on a routine air sampling mission over the Arctic when it strayed into Soviet airspace over the Chukotka Peninsula. The pilot, Captain Charles Maltzby, had been using stellar navigation and had become disoriented. Soviet interceptors were scrambled. American F-102 fighters were also scrambled to escort the U-2 back to friendly airspace. The F-102s carried nuclear-tipped Falcon missiles because that was their standard armament configuration at the time. There was a brief period during which American and Soviet aircraft were in proximity over Soviet territory during the most dangerous week of the Cold War, with nuclear weapons aboard and with no communication between the respective ground controllers to clarify what was happening. Maltzby eventually found his way back into American airspace. When Kennedy was informed of the incident, he reportedly said, in a tone that mixed dark humor with something closer to shock, that there was always some son of a bitch who didn't get the word. What that incident illustrates, and what the B-59 incident illustrates from the other side, is that the Cuban Missile Crisis was not managed as cleanly as the post-crisis narrative suggested. The ExComm deliberations were careful, and the presidential decisions were calibrated. But below the level of those deliberations, in the operational world of submarines and reconnaissance aircraft and air defense commands, things were happening that the decision-makers did not know about, and some of those things were very close to triggering outcomes that no one in the ExComm had authorized, and no one in the Kremlin had authorized, and that would have happened anyway, because the systems in motion had their own momentum, and the people operating within them were working with incomplete information under extreme stress and making reasonable decisions that could have ended everything. The fourth moment involves a piece of malfunctioning equipment and a time of day when most people in the relevant positions were asleep. In November of 1979, a technician at the North American Aerospace Defense Command accidentally inserted a training tape containing a simulated Soviet nuclear attack into the operational computer system. The simulation data was processed by the NORAD computers as real incoming attack data. Duty officers were alerted. Fighter aircraft were scrambled. The National Emergency Airborne Command Post, which is the aircraft used to maintain command and control during a nuclear attack, was launched. The preparation sequence for a nuclear response was initiated. The alert lasted approximately 6 minutes before it was identified as a false alarm. What it took to identify it as a false alarm was the absence of confirmation from the early warning satellites. The satellites were not showing any missile launches from Soviet territory. That absence was the circuit breaker that stopped the sequence. But it is worth dwelling on the structure of that situation for a moment, because what it reveals is that the difference between the 6 minutes of November 9th, 1979, ending in preparation for nuclear war and ending in identification of a technical error was a single class of sensors providing negative confirmation. If those sensors had also malfunctioned, or if they had been unavailable for any reason, or if a sufficiently senior officer had decided that the satellite data was itself compromised, the sequence would have continued. The systems were designed with redundancy, but the redundancy was itself dependent on other systems functioning correctly, and there was no level of the architecture at which the possibility of cascading failure had been fully designed out. 6 months later, in June of 1980, a similar alert was generated by a different technical failure. A faulty computer chip, a 50-cent component in the NORAD warning system, generated a readout indicating that 2 Soviet submarine-launched ballistic missiles were inbound. Then the number updated to 200. Then it updated again. Duty officers went through confirmation procedures. Once again, the satellite sensors did not confirm launches. The alert was eventually identified as a false alarm caused by the failed chip. Investigations afterward identified more than 100 similar false alarms in an 18-month period between 1979 and 1980. Most were resolved quickly. A small number required the kind of active confirmation checking that had been required in the November 1979 and June 1980 cases. Each of those required confirmation checking episodes was, in practical terms, a moment when the decision about whether the world continued or ended was being made by duty officers in a command center working from incomplete information with very limited time. The fifth moment shifts attention to the Soviet side of the same architecture. On September 26, 1983, a Soviet early warning satellite designated OKO detected what its programming identified as a missile launch from the United States. The satellite's alarm systems activated. The duty officer at the Soviet early warning command post in Serpukhov 15, a lieutenant colonel named Stanislav Petrov, received the alert. His job, in formal terms, was to relay confirmed launch data up the chain of command, which would trigger the Soviet response procedures. What the system was telling him was that an American first strike had been initiated. Petrov did not relay the alert. He identified the alarm as a probable false positive based on 2 factors. The first was that the satellite system was relatively new and had a history of malfunctions. The second was that the alert indicated only 5 missiles, and Petrov's assessment was that if the United States was actually launching a first strike, it would launch many more than 5 missiles simultaneously. A genuine first strike would have been designed to overwhelm Soviet defenses, not to send a signal with 5 warheads. He reported the alert as a system malfunction rather than a confirmed launch, and continued to report it as a system malfunction for the duration of the incident, during which his superiors were aware that he had deviated from protocol and were watching to see whether he was right. He was right. The alert had been triggered by sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds in a particular way that the satellite's sensors interpreted as a missile launch exhaust plume. Petrov's decision saved his career in a limited sense and cost it in a larger sense. He was not punished for deviating from protocol because he had been correct. He was also not rewarded because acknowledging that he had made the correct call required acknowledging that the standard protocol, which he had not followed, would have led to the incorrect call. The Soviet military's response to his actions was to transfer him to a less sensitive position and to eventually allow him to retire. For years, he told virtually no one what had happened on September 26, 1983. The incident was not publicly known in the West until after the Soviet Union had dissolved. When it eventually became known, Petrov received some belated international recognition. He died in 2017. His widow found out about his death when a German journalist called to ask about it. The sixth moment requires going back to the early 1950s and the particular logic of the Korean War period, when the possibility of conflict between American and Soviet forces was not hypothetical but operational. In 1953, during the final stages of the Korean armistice negotiations, American strategic planners developed a contingency plan for expanding the conflict if negotiations failed. The plan included options for strikes on Chinese territory and, depending on how the Soviets responded, potentially on Soviet territory as well. The existence of such planning is not surprising in itself, because military establishments plan for contingencies as a matter of routine. What is notable about this particular period is the degree to which the planning operated with assumptions about nuclear weapons that would have been unacceptable to most of the civilian leadership if they had been fully briefed on the details. The distinction between tactical and strategic nuclear weapons was not yet clearly established in doctrine, and field commanders in the Korean theater had been given authorities for nuclear weapons employment that were substantially broader than the civilian chain of command appeared to fully understand. The gap between what the civilians thought they had authorized and what the military actually had authority to do was not a small gap. It was a significant structural feature of American nuclear command and control in the early 1950s, and it was not fully corrected until after several administrations had worked through the problem over the course of many years. The seventh moment involves a naval accident in the North Pacific and the particular silence that followed it. In April of 1968, the USS Scorpion, a nuclear-powered attack submarine, was lost with all hands somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean. The Navy's investigation concluded that the most likely cause was an accident involving one of the submarine's own torpedoes. The Scorpion was one of 4 submarines lost during the 1960s by the nuclear powers, a figure that includes the American submarine Thresher in 1963. The Soviet submarines K-129 in 1968 and K-8 in 1970. What links these losses beyond the obvious fact of their tragedy is the question of what happens when a nuclear-armed submarine disappears. The K-129 was carrying nuclear ballistic missiles. The United States conducted a secret operation, Project Azorian, to recover the submarine from the ocean floor. The operation succeeded in recovering a portion of the submarine, including, according to declassified accounts, some of the crew's remains and some technical intelligence materials. Whether nuclear warheads were recovered was never officially confirmed. The entire operation was conducted under deep classification and was only partially acknowledged decades later. The Soviet government officially denied for years that the submarine had been lost because acknowledging its loss would have required acknowledging what it had been carrying. The eighth moment takes place in West Germany in 1961 and involves the physical act of drawing a line. The Berlin Wall went up on August 13, 1961, and the immediate military situation it created has not been fully absorbed into the popular understanding of that event. The wall was not simply a political symbol, it was a physical barrier constructed across a city that had significant military implications for both sides. American military forces in Berlin had standing orders that included contingencies for forced access to specific corridors and routes. The question of whether American military vehicles would attempt to push through East German checkpoints after the wall went up was not hypothetical. There were specific confrontations, most notably at Checkpoint Charlie in October 1961, where American and Soviet tanks faced each other at a distance of roughly 100 meters for 16 hours. Both sides had live ammunition. Both sides had orders. Neither side fired. The standoff ended when both sets of tanks simultaneously withdrew, in a sequence that had been quietly negotiated through back channels. But the 16 hours during which the tanks were facing each other were 16 hours during which a decision by any individual commander on either side to open fire could have initiated a sequence that neither government had authorized and that might not have been stoppable once it started. The ninth moment is almost entirely technical in character, and that is precisely what makes it significant. In 1961, a B-52 bomber carrying two Mark 39 nuclear bombs broke apart in flight over Goldsboro, North Carolina. Both bombs fell free of the aircraft. One bomb behaved in a manner consistent with an accidental detonation sequence, arming itself as it fell and going through most of the safing and arming steps before impact. An investigation afterward found that 3 of the 4 safety mechanisms on that weapon had failed. The 4th safety mechanism, a simple low-voltage switch, was the only thing that prevented a thermonuclear detonation over the American South, with a yield estimated at between 3 and 4 megatons. The incident was classified for decades. When it was finally acknowledged and the details were released, the figure that received the most attention was the calculation by some analysts that the bomb, if it had detonated, could have produced fallout reaching as far as Washington, Baltimore, and Philadelphia. The Goldsboro incident is notable not just for how close it came, but for what it revealed about the safety architecture of American nuclear weapons in that period. The weapons had been certified as safe for flight carriage based on safety mechanisms that, under actual accident conditions, did not perform as designed. The investigation led to modifications, but the modifications addressed specific identified failure modes and could not guarantee against failure modes that had not yet been identified. This is a fundamental feature of complex engineered systems, which is that their failure modes cannot be fully known in advance, because some failure modes only reveal themselves through actual failures. The military establishment understood this in the abstract while simultaneously being required to maintain operational readiness in a way that could not accommodate the full implications of that understanding. The bombs stayed armed. The bombers kept flying. The 10th moment involves ideology, paranoia, and a fundamental misread of the other side's intentions at a moment of maximum danger. In November of 1983, NATO conducted a military exercise called Able Archer 83. The exercise was designed to practice the procedures for transitioning from conventional to nuclear warfare, and it was more realistic in its simulation of an actual nuclear release sequence than previous exercises had been. The Soviets, who were monitoring the exercise through intelligence channels, could not definitively distinguish between an exercise and a genuine preparation for a surprise nuclear attack. The Soviet intelligence services had been operating since 1981 under a program called Ryan, an acronym for the Russian phrase meaning nuclear missile attack, which was a standing intelligence collection effort designed to detect indicators of an American first strike. The indicators the Ryan program was watching for included things like increased activity at military command posts, unusual communications patterns, movement of military personnel, and changes in the alert status of nuclear forces. Able Archer 83 generated precisely those indicators. The KGB residentures in Western Europe sent urgent cables to Moscow reporting that the exercise might be a cover for an actual attack. Some Soviet military units were placed on increased alert. There was a period during Able Archer 83 when the Soviet military was in a higher state of readiness in anticipation of a potential American first strike than at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Americans conducting the exercise did not know this. The intelligence agencies were aware of Soviet nervousness about the exercise, but the full scope of the Soviet response was not understood until after a KGB officer named Oleg Gordievsky, who was also working as a British intelligence asset, reported what he had seen from inside the Soviet intelligence apparatus. The post-exercise assessment, conducted after Gordievsky's information was evaluated, concluded that the world had come closer to nuclear war during Able Archer 83 than American leadership had realized while it was happening. The 11th moment is about a single individual and what he did with approximately 9 minutes. On September 26, 1983, the same date as the Petrov incident, Soviet military doctrine required that the duty officer at an early warning command post, upon receiving confirmed launch data, immediately relay that data upward for response authorization. The time available for decision-making before Soviet missiles would need to be launched on warning was approximately 9 minutes from the moment of confirmed detection. Petrov had that 9 minutes. He spent it watching his subordinates process the alert data, talking to his duty colleagues, and deciding whether the alert was real. What he did not do was relay it upward, which is what the procedure required. He absorbed the 9 minutes himself, rather than passing the decision to someone with more authority to make it. This was not authorized. It was not within his remit. It was a unilateral decision by a mid-level officer to substitute his own judgment for the judgment of a system specifically designed to remove individual judgment from the most critical decision in human history. He was right. The system was wrong. And it is worth spending some time with the fact that both of those statements are simultaneously true, because what they describe is a system that could only be saved from its own logic by people willing to violate that logic at personal risk. That is not a stable design. That is a feature that can only work as long as the right person happens to be in the right position at the right moment, and there is no mechanism to guarantee that outcome. The 12th moment requires a brief explanation of geography and submarine doctrine. The Norwegian Sea and the Barents Sea, in NATO strategic planning during the Cold War, were referred to as the Giayuk Gap, an acronym for Greenland, Iceland, United Kingdom. This stretch of ocean was the primary passage for Soviet submarines moving from their northern fleet bases toward the Atlantic, and it was correspondingly the primary focus of NATO anti-submarine warfare operations. The interactions between Soviet submarines and NATO anti-submarine forces in that region were frequent, close, and routinely dangerous, and they were conducted under rules of engagement that allowed for provocative maneuvers that would have been considered acts of war in any other operational context. In 1968, the Soviet submarine K-129 was lost in the Pacific, as previously noted. In 1970, the Soviet submarine K-8 sank in the Bay of Biscay after a fire. In 1983, the Soviet submarine K-278 Komsomolets, a titanium-hulled boat designed for deep diving, was lost in the Norwegian Sea. The Komsomolets was carrying 2 nuclear-tipped torpedoes. It sank in roughly 5,000 feet of water. Soviet and later Russian salvage attempts recovered some of the crew, but were unable to secure the nuclear weapons, which remain on the ocean floor. The radioactive condition of those weapons and the potential for long-term contamination of the Norwegian Sea has been a subject of ongoing scientific monitoring. The weapons have not exploded. They have also not been retrieved. They are there now, as this is being said, on the floor of the Norwegian Sea in the dark, degrading slowly. The 13th moment involves a technical system that operated in the background of everything else and whose existence was not publicly confirmed until after the Soviet Union had already dissolved. The Soviet Union built a system called Perimeter, which became known in the West under the name Dead Hand. Perimeter was designed to address a specific strategic problem, which is what happens to the Soviet nuclear deterrent if American decapitation strikes succeed in killing the Soviet leadership before it can authorize a response. The answer Perimeter provided was to create an automated system capable of issuing launch commands to Soviet intercontinental ballistic missiles without requiring authorization from the political leadership under conditions where the political leadership was either unreachable or dead. The system worked through a series of sensors that monitored for the indicators of a nuclear attack, including seismic activity consistent with nuclear detonations, electromagnetic pulse readings, and radiation detection. If those indicators were present, and if the command authorities had activated the system, and if a specified time period had passed without the system receiving a human stand-down command, Perimeter would proceed to issue launch authorization through a dedicated communication system. The launch authorization would go to specially hardened command rockets, which would fly over Soviet ICBM fields, broadcasting launch codes to all available missiles. The entire system was designed to function without any human input after the initial activation. and it was designed to keep functioning through the worst conditions that a nuclear exchange would create. The Americans learned about perimeter gradually and never had complete information about its architecture or its current operational status. Soviet officials confirmed its existence publicly in 1993 after the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Russian officials subsequently confirmed that the system had been maintained and modernized after 1991 and that it remains operational today. The precise activation criteria, the current condition of the system's sensors, and the specific circumstances under which it would actually issue launch commands are not publicly known. What is known is that a system exists, built by a state that no longer exists, designed to launch nuclear weapons based on automated sensor readings, and that this system has been maintained and updated by a successor state that has its own reasons for wanting the uncertainty about the system's behavior to persist. The 14th moment is about the specific quality of danger that is produced when large military machines move toward each other without adequate communication. In the fall of 1973, the Yom Kippur War between Israel and a coalition of Arab states created a crisis that drew both superpowers toward direct confrontation. The Soviet Union was supplying Egypt and Syria. The United States was supplying Israel. As the military situation shifted in Israel's favor and Israeli forces began to encircle the Egyptian Third Army, the Soviet Union began discussing the possibility of deploying Soviet troops to enforce a ceasefire. The possibility of Soviet troops directly engaging Israeli forces raised the prospect of American forces directly engaging Soviet forces. Because American security commitments to Israel were sufficiently robust that a Soviet military action against Israeli forces would almost certainly have triggered an American response. The Nixon administration, operating under conditions of considerable domestic political distraction because Watergate was consuming significant White House attention in October 1973, placed American military forces on DEFCON 3, which is the third highest alert level, in response to the Soviet troop deployment signals. The decision to raise the alert level was made with limited input from the president, who was in the residence and who was, according to accounts from people present at the time, in a state that did not suggest full engagement with the problem. The alert was communicated to Soviet intelligence and was intended as a signal that the United States was prepared to respond militarily if Soviet troops were deployed. The Soviet Union stepped back from the troop deployment option. The crisis was resolved through diplomacy, but it was resolved against a backdrop of American nuclear forces at elevated alert, under a decision-making process that was operating below the level of presidential engagement that the public and most of the government assumed was present. The 15th moment involves a scenario that military planners spent decades preparing for and that revealed in its preparation how the systems designed to manage nuclear war might actually cause it. Beginning in the 1970s, American strategic planners worked extensively on the problem of launch on warning, which is the doctrine of launching nuclear forces upon detection of an incoming attack, rather than waiting for the attack to detonate before responding. The logic of launch on warning is straightforward. If you wait for confirmation that you are being attacked before you launch your response, you risk having your response capability destroyed by the attack you are responding to. Therefore, you launch on the warning rather than on the confirmation. The problem with launch on warning, which was well understood by the planners who developed it, is that it requires you to make a decision to initiate nuclear war based on sensor data that might be wrong. The false alarms of 1979 and 1980 and the Petrov incident of 1983 are all illustrations of what the word might actually means in that context. The 16th moment takes place in the Pacific in 1981 during a major American naval exercise called Ocean Venture 81. The exercise deployed an unusually large number of American surface ships and submarines in the Pacific and Atlantic simultaneously, conducting operations that simulated an aggressive offensive campaign against Soviet naval forces. The scale and aggressiveness of the exercise, combined with its proximity to Soviet territorial waters, generated substantial concern within the Soviet military and intelligence establishment about American intentions. The concern was not simply that the exercise was large. The concern was that its pattern of operations resembled what an actual opening move of a conventional war against the Soviet Union might look like. Soviet intelligence analysis in the early 1980s was increasingly focused on the possibility of an American conventional or nuclear-first strike, and Ocean Venture 81 was evaluated within that analytical framework. The exercise contributed to the background of Soviet strategic anxiety that characterized the early 1980s and that made Able Archer 83 as dangerous as it turned out to be. The 17th moment is about what happens when the lines of authority in a nuclear command structure become ambiguous, which is a condition that arises more frequently than the formal doctrine suggests. In January of 1961, during the transition from the Eisenhower administration to the Kennedy administration, there was a period of several days during which the authorizations for nuclear weapons employment were, in technical terms, somewhat unclear. The incoming administration had not yet fully briefed all relevant commanders on the new administration's protocols. The outgoing administration's authorizations had technically lapsed or were in the process of being revised. The actual military personnel responsible for nuclear weapons were operating under standing orders that had been issued under the previous authority structure and that remained in effect until formally superseded. This transition period was identified as a vulnerability by Kennedy administration officials who were briefing themselves on the nuclear command structure, and it led to a significant effort to clarify and formalize the chain of authorization. But the effort to clarify also revealed how much ambiguity had existed in the previous arrangements, and the exercise of clarification itself required acknowledging, internally at least, that the previous arrangements had not been as clean as they appeared. The 18th moment involves the particular dangers of conventional military forces in proximity to nuclear weapons, and the fact that the people operating those conventional forces were not always fully informed about the nuclear context they were operating in. In August of 1968, Soviet forces entered Czechoslovakia to suppress the Prague Spring. The military operation was large, rapid, and closely watched by NATO. American and European military forces went to heightened readiness as a precaution against a Soviet operation that extended beyond Czechoslovakia, because NATO's assessment of Soviet intentions in that period was not reliable enough to rule out a broader offensive. The Soviet operation was specifically designed to present the West with a fait accompli, moving fast enough that there was no time for a diplomatic response before the operation was complete. This approach worked operationally. It also created a period of several hours, during which NATO forces were at heightened readiness and Soviet forces were in active military operations in Eastern Europe, and the communication channels between the two were not sufficient to provide the clarity that would have been necessary to prevent misinterpretation of either side's movements as something other than what they were. The 19th moment is one of the most technically complex and also one of the least known outside of specialized military history. In 1995, more than 3 years after the end of the Cold War, the Russian nuclear early warning system detected the launch of what it initially assessed as a ballistic missile fired from the vicinity of Norway. The alert was processed through the chain of command, and the Russian president, Boris Yeltsin, was presented with the nuclear briefcase, the device used to transmit launch authorization codes, and informed that he had a limited time window to decide whether to authorize a retaliatory strike. This was the first time in the history of the nuclear era that a head of state had actually been presented with the nuclear briefcase under conditions that were not clearly a drill. Yeltsin consulted with his military advisors. He did not authorize a launch. The alert was eventually determined to be a Norwegian scientific rocket, the Black Brant the Waytuned, which had been launched to study the northern lights and whose trajectory had superficially resembled that of a submarine-launched ballistic missile. Norway had notified Russian authorities of the launch through official channels before it occurred. The notification had not been communicated to the relevant parts of the Russian military command structure. The 20th moment is about the operational reality of what it actually means to keep nuclear weapons ready for rapid employment over a period of decades, which is that the people responsible for those weapons are not uniformly exceptional, are subject to the full range of human weakness and error, and are operating under conditions that produce stress, boredom, compartmentalization, and occasional lapses in the security and safety procedures that are supposed to prevent unauthorized or accidental weapon employment. Between the late 1950s and the 1990s, the American Nuclear Command Structure identified numerous incidents of personnel failing to follow required procedures, of security lapses at weapons storage facilities, of maintenance errors that left weapons in states that the safety protocols were designed to prevent, and of individual behavior by weapons custodians that raised questions about their suitability for the positions they held. The aggregate of these incidents was not publicly reported. They were managed administratively, meaning that they generated internal reports, investigations, procedural revisions, and personnel actions, and the results of those processes were classified, and the incidents themselves were not disclosed. The public picture of the nuclear enterprise was of a rigorously controlled system managed by highly selected individuals under multiple redundant safeguards. The internal picture was of a system that required continuous and intensive management to maintain a level of performance that was considerably below the public picture, and that required, on a regular basis, the correction of problems that should not have existed. The 21st moment requires attention to a specific quality of the Cold War that is easy to miss from a distance, which is the degree to which both superpowers were conducting continuous intelligence operations against each other that, if discovered in certain circumstances, could have been interpreted as preparations for attack. In 1983, a Soviet intelligence operation discovered that American intelligence had recruited a source within the Soviet Foreign Ministry. The discovery of that recruitment prompted a review of other potential penetrations, which led to additional discoveries, which led to a period of intensive counterintelligence activity within the Soviet security apparatus that coincided with the already heightened strategic tensions of 1983. The combination of the discovery of American intelligence penetrations, the Able Archer exercise, the Reagan administration's rhetorical posture toward the Soviet Union as an evil empire, and the Soviet early warning system's false alarm in September of that year created a confluence of stresses that made 1983 the most dangerous year of the Cold War since 1962, and possibly since the very beginning of the conflict. The people in the middle of it on both sides did not have a view of the whole picture. They had their piece of it, their section of the signal, and they were doing their jobs, and the aggregate of all of those people doing their jobs in that particular year created a situation that was extremely close to catastrophe, and that ended not through any single act of wisdom or restraint, but through the simultaneous operation of multiple small contingencies, none of which individually would have been sufficient, and all of which together were just enough. The 22nd moment is perhaps the most abstract of the set. And it is abstract because it describes not a specific incident, but a structural condition that pervaded the entire Cold War, and that was most visible in the final years before the Soviet collapse. By the mid-1980s, the Soviet command and control architecture for nuclear weapons was showing signs of the same institutional decay that was afflicting every other part of the Soviet system. The encrypted communications infrastructure was aging. The maintenance of early warning sensors was increasingly difficult under budget constraints. The personnel assigned to nuclear command and control positions were drawn from a military establishment that was experiencing significant morale and readiness problems. The reliability of the chain of command that connected Soviet political authorities to the nuclear forces was, by the assessment of Western intelligence, lower in the late 1980s than it had been at any previous point in the Cold War. At the same time, the Soviet political system was undergoing radical transformation under Gorbachev, creating uncertainty about who actually held authority over which elements of the military establishment at any given moment. The August 1991 coup attempt against Gorbachev, which lasted 3 days, and during which the coup plotters claimed to have the authority of the Soviet state, while Gorbachev remained in Crimea and Yeltsin was rallying opposition from atop a tank in Moscow, created a 72-hour period during which the actual authority over Soviet nuclear weapons was genuinely unclear. The coup failed. But the coup's failure did not resolve the underlying problem of what happens to nuclear weapons during a period of acute political instability in a nuclear state. It demonstrated the problem in real time and was resolved only because the political situation was resolved, not because any institutional safeguard had functioned as designed. When the Soviet Union formally dissolved on December 25, 1991, the nuclear weapons that had been deployed across the Soviet republics became, overnight, the property of 4 newly independent states: Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. The transfer of those weapons, the verification of their security, the management of the command codes, and the gradual consolidation of all former Soviet nuclear weapons under Russian control was a process that consumed most of the first decade after the Cold War's end, and that produced its own set of near incidents and moments of acute danger that are largely invisible in the standard accounts of the post-Cold War period. Ukraine had, at the moment of independence, the 3rd largest nuclear arsenal in the world. The process of transferring that arsenal to Russia, negotiated through what became the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, in which Ukraine gave up its weapons in exchange for security assurances, was not without its own complicated pressures and uncertainties. What was not transferred, what could not be transferred, was the architecture of thinking that the Cold War had produced over 44 years. The targeting doctrines, the war plans, the early warning systems, the command and control procedures, the institutional cultures of the military establishments that had managed nuclear weapons under Cold War conditions, the hair-trigger alert postures, the fundamental orientation of the nuclear enterprise toward rapid response under conditions of uncertainty. None of these ended with the dissolution of the Soviet Union. They were modified, in some cases substantially. They were not replaced. The missiles that had been aimed at Soviet cities had their targets reprogrammed, but the missiles remained. The submarines that had patrolled the oceans under Cold War protocols continued to patrol. The early warning satellites that had generated false alarms in 1979 and 1980 continued to operate, with successes and upgrades, because the function they served did not cease to be necessary simply because the political context had changed. The Cold War ended with a press conference and a document and a flag being lowered. The systems that had sustained it, the weapons and the doctrines and the command structures and the institutional logic of mutual assured destruction continued to operate. They operate now. The missiles are there. The submarines are submerged. The early warning networks are processing data. The protocols are in place. The launch procedures exist. The authority structures that would trigger those procedures are defined and maintained and exercised. The world that the Cold War produced did not dissolve when the Cold War ended. It incorporated the ending and continued.